Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 64 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Winnipeg Jets, in which the Sharks have won 3-2 in overtime. Now, for the first 59 minutes of this game, it reminded me a lot of a game that they played a couple of weeks ago against the Vegas Golden Knights. The Sharks were pretty thoroughly outplayed, but due to some heroic goaltending, which at the time was from Kaapo Kähkönen, the Sharks ended up in a 1-1 tie, leading up to the final moments of the third period. In that one, it was, I believe, William Carrier who would score just in the dying seconds of that game to take a 2-1 lead and essentially make that amazing performance from Kähkönen that night all for naught. This game, somewhat similar. It was 1-1 for a large part of it, and for a large part of it, the Sharks were indeed getting outplayed. But this time, instead of the dying seconds of the third period having the game-winning goal, it looked like it would be with about 5 minutes to go in the third period, as Nate Schmidt would make it 2-1 for Winnipeg. However, as the time would wear on, the Sharks would manage to pull the goaltender, and it seemed as though they had something cooking here, getting some decent zone time, not a ton of chances on net, but you could sort of feel that build up towards potentially a game-tying goal, and eventually that did indeed happen with about 10 seconds to go on the clock. A Carlson shot sort of deflects awkwardly off of a Jets player straight to Tomas Hertl, and he's able to bury it to get the game-tying goal in this one. And then in overtime we go. The San Jose Sharks, while at the beginning of this season had some success in overtime, recently they have been losing a lot. They have some of the highest overtime losses in the entire league at this point. And the Jets, on the other hand, they have a significantly better record in overtime. I believe they said it was 6-1 or maybe even 7-1. So it seemed as though the Sharks would not be able to close this one out. And I should note as well, they do go with a William Eklund, Tomas Hertl, Erik Karlsson trio to start. Usually, of course, it was back in the day Hertl, Meyer, Karlsson, no Meyer anymore. So Eklund is given that chance. And the Sharks, while they do get an early opportunity, it then goes to the Winnipeg Jets. They get a couple of decent looks in the zone, but eventually it is a Logan Couture breakaway as he was able to come on the ice for the one change that they managed to make for Tomas Hertl, and he scores to get the Sharks the victory 3-2. A relatively hollow victory, I guess you could say. You know, leading up to these last few games of the season, the Sharks now have 18 remaining. It is quite obvious that the Sharks are not going to lose, or almost certainly won't lose, I should say, all 18 of these games, and so you're going to have some wins here or there. And at this point, with the Sharks not being able to make the playoffs, you hope that the wins can at the very least be, fun to watch, exciting games in which the Sharks are actually playing well. And while this game certainly had an interesting end to it with that, final seconds game-tying goal and then the overtime winner, this was generally a game in which the Sharks played quite poorly and were essentially just bailed out completely by their goaltender James Reimer. If you even take a look at the 2 goals scored during regulation, both came off of pretty fortunate bounces for the San Jose Sharks. This Tomas Hertl goal, like I already mentioned, goes off of a Erik Karlsson shot, deflects off of a Jets player straight to him, and the Lorentz goal, while not technically a lucky bounce per se, this is just the Jets goaltender playing very poorly, just seemingly not really engaged in the game in some way. He's extremely nonchalantly trying to cover the puck with his glove, and then it keeps getting pushed away as if he's attempting to, I don't even know what the situation is there, but eventually Lorentz just sort of on his third whack at it is able to put it in the net. So that was an awkward misplay for the Jets goaltender. And besides those 2 goals, the Sharks really didn't get much generated in this game. The first period was rather choppy. The second period was quite terrible for San Jose. The Jets just ran over them, and in the third period still not a ton going on until those last couple of minutes. And so this is a win for San Jose. It's cool to see, I guess, with those the last minute heroics from Hertl and then the Couture overtime winner, but it still is kind of a hollow victory, especially when we take a look at the standings here. So just yesterday the Coyotes lost in overtime to the New Jersey Devils. I actually forgot to fill in the point totals, but they are now at 52 with this one would have been 4 points ahead had the Sharks indeed lost this game in regulation, but that doesn't end up happening. The Sharks get the victory, and so now tie the Ducks for that fourth last spot at the grand total of 50 points. Meanwhile, the Blackhawks and the Blue Jackets below the Sharks did lose games recently, and so they have not made any gains in the standings, and the Sharks find themselves 3 ahead of the Blackhawks and 4 ahead of the Blue Jackets, making it that much more difficult to be able to get to that final bottom spot in the standings. It should be noted that there are some games remaining here for the San Jose Sharks against some of these bottom teams, which means those are going to be extremely pivotal 4-point games that I'm sure every player is going to want to win, but every GM in that situation is going to want to lose, and we'll see when we eventually cross that bridge how those games go. On to the players to talk about. We didn't have any lineup changes on the forward side of things, but the defense is very interesting, but we'll get to that a bit later. So here with the first line, we have Barabanov, Couture, and Andreas Johnson. Generally, a pretty muted game for all lines, and the first line was definitely not an exception to that. Barabanov was noticeable at times, but also for some pretty bad reasons, I would say. Had a really awkward hooking call in the third period that would sort of eventually lead to the Jets' goal, even though that wasn't on the power play, so that wasn't great. Andreas Johnson was completely unnoticeable. If you had told me he wasn't in this game, I would probably believe you. And Couture, while he would end up with the overtime game winner, wasn't anything amazing during regulation play, so generally a pretty meh game from this top line. On the second line, we of course have Eklund's second game up here with the San Jose Sharks, yet again coming very close to eclipsing the 20-minute mark. He was once again inserted into many situations. Like I said, got the first overtime shift of the game, was on the ice for the 6-on-5 goal for the San Jose Sharks that would tie this one, plus just generally being on the second, or you could even call it the first line at this point. In my previous review, I gave Eklund a score of about 5.5 to 6 on 10 for his performance there, and I don't think that has necessarily changed all that much. He still had some okay offensive plays for some okay vision that just weren't really converted on all that well. For instance, there was a nice Eklund pass over to Zetterlund, which then he tries to pass it over to Hertl, and it kind of just dies there, but it was still okay. And I did think also there were some somewhat noticeable improvements in Eklund's defensive zone play, where he did kind of find himself a lot here tonight, just due to the general fact that the Sharks were getting outplayed quite significantly here tonight. And so Eklund, I don't think he was any worse than he was in the previous game. I don't think he was all that much better either, which means his grade kind of just remains pretty much the same, in my opinion, of about a 5.5 or 6 on 10. The other player who I want to talk about on this second line would indeed be Fabian Zetterlund. Was brought over in that Timo Meier trade, and I've seen some Sharks fans, have the sentiment of, wow, I really like Zetterlund, and I'm not sure if that's maybe something I'm missing here, or if it's just coping with the fact that the Sharks got rid of Timo Meier and it's not necessarily looking, at the very least at the moment, like an amazing trade for them. But I really haven't seen much from Zetterlund in these 4 games that he has played that I've actually enjoyed. Pretty much the only thing that has been rather noticeable is how strong he is on the puck, which is nice. A 5'11 player at 220 pounds. To put that into perspective, the other winger on this line, Eklund, who is also 5'11, is only 181 pounds, and even the center on this line, Tomas Hertl, who is 6'3", is only coming in at 215 pounds. So Zetterlund, just an absolute ball of chaos, you could say, in that way. Just an immovable object sometimes on the puck. But the problem is that even when he has the puck, he'll either just give it away himself, not necessarily get pushed off of it, or take a relatively weak shot. He has been in situations where he's gotten a couple of okay one-timers off, but again, there hasn't necessarily been a ton of positives in this game. Now, I guess the good news would be is that there weren't a ton of negatives in his game either, so he might just in general come in as just a okay type of player. But if New Jersey fans were hyping him up as like, oh, well, if he's just given the opportunity here on the top 6, he's going to at least be a 50-point player, he's going to be really... I'm not necessarily seeing as much of that. Maybe as he continues to get acclimated, maybe if he's indeed on the San Jose Sharks for this next season, which he very well should be, then with like sort of an off season, a preseason, training camp, all of those things under his belt, he could come in fresh slate and actually do well. But at the moment, as we're leading up to the last few games of this regular season, and he's already played about 4 games with the Sharks, there's not really that much there that I'm seeing. When it comes to the third line of Gregor Sturm and Svechnikov, they did have a couple of okay shifts. I would say earlier on in the game is where they were more apparent, but it kind of faded as the game went on, especially since they just weren't getting as much ice time as the game wore on. But I would still say a relatively decent-ish game for the Sharks' third line for sure. And then we get to the fourth line, which had a couple of notable things. The first one, of course, they did score in this one, and while it wasn't necessarily amazing effort from the fourth line, like wow, Lindblom great play, Lorentz great play, because it was just mostly just the Jets goaltender playing poorly, it is still technically a goal. The second noticeable thing is, of course, with Kevin Labanc's ice time. We know Labanc's history thus far this season has seen him healthy scratched in multiple games. At a point, there was like a 8-game stretch where he just kept getting healthy scratched over and over and over again. Here tonight, he gets less than 6 minutes of ice time, which was kind of not understandable for me, but I guess David Quinn really has a much closer eye on Labanc or something that I'm not seeing, because I thought he had an okay game, played decently well, had a nice assist on the Lorentz goal, didn't end up taking a minor penalty, which is actually progress for Kevin Labanc, so I thought it was an okay game, but apparently not. On to the defensive side of things, the big news here tonight was that Nikolai Knyzhov returns to the lineup for the first time in a very long time. For those Sharks fans who will remember him back in the 2021 season, that is 2 years ago at this point, he had come into the league. That was in the 56-game shortened season. He played all 56 games, primarily on the pairing with Erik Karlsson, and actually looked rather good. There was some excitement going into the 21-22 season, what he would be able to do, but unfortunately ends up getting injured and missing the entirety of that year. And then unfortunately again in this past offseason, he gets injured once more, requires offseason surgery, and then is predicted to miss about 3 or 4 months. So at the beginning of this year, again, not playing any games. That is now a year and a half of actual seasons not playing any games. He comes to the Barracuda, gets a conditioning stint, plays a few games there, eventually does return healthy, plays with the Barracuda still, and now finally, especially with the injury to Radim Shemek, he draws back into the lineup, was seemingly eased into it, even though this was indeed a game in which Jacob McDonald gets injured rather early on, just plays 2 minutes of ice time, so the Sharks are rolling with 5 defensemen. Knyzhov is still very much eased into this. He didn't even eclipse the 15-minute mark, but in the ice time that I did see from Knyzhov, I was actually relatively impressed, especially for a player who hasn't played any NHL hockey for a year and a half. And it's not as though he's like some 30-year-old veteran or something who's jumping back in and he has like already 8 seasons under his belt. Knyzhov played 1 full year, which wasn't even a full year, in the 2021 season of 56 games, and then a year and a half later, he missed more games than he has been actually playing. He's able to jump in and actually look pretty good, so that was nice to see. Hopefully the Sharks do continue to ease him in, because he was a relatively promising defensive prospect for the San Jose Sharks a couple years back. Karlsson, on the other hand, also an extremely give and take game, had a couple of real big issues in this one, but also a couple of really very nice plays. He ended up with yet another 2 assists, one on the Hurdle goal, one on the Logan Couture goal, both of them primary assists, which puts him at 82 points on the year, guaranteeing him that point per game pace and matching his career high from back in the 15-16 season. It should be noted that, of course, scoring is much higher in recent years, especially this past year and this current year, than it was 8 years ago. Just to put it into perspective, back in the 2015 season, it was Jamie Benn who won the Art Ross with 87 points. If we take a look at this year, not only have multiple players already passed the 87-point mark, I believe Connor McDavid had passed that about 2 months ago, and we're yet not even done the season. So clearly scoring is way up, so maybe this 82 points is not as impressive as the 82 points back in the day for Erik Karlsson, but if he manages to get to that 100-point mark, that's pretty much out the window. That will certainly be a massive career year for him, and while the Sharks don't have a ton of weapons to help get him there, as they have traded away Timo Meier primarily, it could still technically happen. And then the other defenseman who I do want to mention at this point is Mario Ferraro, who was given a ton of ice time here tonight due to the injury to Jacob McDonald and the fact that Knyzhov is not fully up to game speed yet. So he got about 24 and a half minutes, and I must say it was a very difficult to watch. Let's just say 24 and a half minutes. I found myself at least half a dozen times just rolling my eyes at the bad plays that Ferraro was making. It was just standing up way too aggressively at the blue line and getting caught flat-footed, losing battles along the wall that he really should not be losing, giving pucks away in the defensive zone. It was just honestly a real slog to watch. It was a big reason, considering he played so much ice time, it was a big reason why the Sharks had issues defensively. I won't say it's entirely on him. Generally, the defensive core wasn't great for sure, but Ferraro not really a positive at all in that particular role, but I guess they'll give him the ice time anyway. Who am I to judge? He blocks a lot of shots, so I guess good for him. And then that will do it for this, or actually should mention the goaltender before I end the review. Fantastic game for James Reimer, which is not something I have said a lot recently. It looked like I mentioned earlier, it was going to go the same way as Kakinen's great game against the Vegas Golden Knights a couple of days ago, but this time the Sharks actually come in with a bit of right at the end goal support, and so Reimer, a spectacular game. The Sharks could have very easily been down like 3-1 or if not 4-1 by the end of that second period, if not for some insane Reimer saves, so he definitely deserves this one. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action tomorrow as they'll take on the Colorado Avalanche. So back-to-back games here. They're playing against the defending Stanley Cup champions, who, to be fair, haven't necessarily looked like defending Stanley Cup champions thus far this season. But of course, you never know what can happen with that team, still extremely skilled, and we'll see what the Sharks will do. Class dismissed.